We're looking at really the last phase of Old Testament theology, dealing with eschatology, which means the doctrine of last things. We've dealt with the day of the Lord, the Old Testament concept of the remnant, which of course is taken up in the New Testament, a remnant. Jesus said, few will be saved. It isn't popular, but it's Bible. And for our concern, we should make sure we're among the remnant. You do that, first of all, by faith. Now we come tonight to the Old Testament doctrine of the future life. Now we have to keep in mind that the Old Testament saints did not have full revelation. They had sufficient to give them a hope of a future life. So we'll be looking at the doctrine of Sheol, which King James almost always translates as hell, and of course hell is an English word. Sheol is not that. We'll see what it is. Beliefs regarding the dead, burial, the family grave, Sheol in the grave, the relation between Sheol and Hades, and so on. First of all, a few words of introduction to the doctrine of the future life. That's the third aspect under the doctrine of last things. Last things with respect to Old Testament understanding. Death in the Old Testament had profound spiritual implications. Several reasons for this. We get this from the Old Testament, first of all. It was visited upon men as judgment for sin. Death is quite abnormal, unnatural. The message of the Old Testament is men die because men sin. So death is not like it is so often today, painted and perfumed and displayed as something we should all look forward to. But death was the result of sin. Another thing we see in the Old Testament concerning death is that God is in control of it. It doesn't just happen. Since the Old Testament depicts God as a sovereign God, then death, no less than life, is at his sovereign control. He himself says that he holds the power to give life or to take it away in the Old Testament. Exodus 4. Another consideration is that we see in the Old Testament that while death might end the physical life, it's not the end of human personality, because the Old Testament shows that while the body goes to the grave, the nephesh, or the person, goes into Sheol, which is not the grave, as we'll see later. Sheol is never confused with the grave, as the King James translators so often did it. Now, there is a hope of a future life in the Old Testament that we will get to eventually, maybe next time, that they weren't ignorant of the fact that to be absent from the body was to be present with the Lord. That was an Old Testament revelation, as we shall see. But interestingly enough, even though the Israelites had hope of a future life, that's seen clearly throughout the New Testament, nevertheless, there was one segment within Israel itself that denied this. And this party, a religio-political party, arose, as we've already taught you, during the period between the Testaments. And we have them named in the New Testament. They're called the party of the Sadducees. Now, the Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the body. If you read the book of Acts, remember Paul got out of a jam once because of the fact that he, being a Pharisee, knew that. And he was being judged by Sadducees who controlled the courts, as we've taught you already. The Sadducees, remember, were in charge of the Sanhedrin. The high priest was head of that. But the Sadducees denied the resurrection of the body. They denied the doctrine of angels. And the reason they did that, they didn't believe in spirits. So thirdly, they denied the reality of spirit beings, which of course would include angels. They held only to the Pentateuch, first 5 books of Moses. And so they didn't have much hope after death. Sadducees. We'll say more about them later. Well, that by way of introduction. Now, the doctrine of Sheol, first of all, we want to deal with some terms, not pronounce Sheol as it is in some of the versions, but Sheol. But since no one would know what you're talking about, I guess you'll have to say Sheol. If you talk to a Hebrew and you said Sheol, he may not know what you meant. But if you said Sheol, just like the E isn't there, almost. I remember years ago when I first started studying Hebrew in the seminary, someone gave me, or I got it some way, a little gold Star of David. It had on there that, and I didn't know what it stood for. And so I was in New Jersey on the boardwalk, sitting there on a bench, and there was a Jew sitting there by me. And I showed him that. I said, "What is that?" He said, "Tson." Tson. Well, he didn't help me at all. Then later on, after I learned a little more Hebrew, it's Zion. But if you say Zion to a person who speaks Hebrew, oh, of course he would know what that is. But generally, mispronounced words don't mean a thing to a person who speaks that language. And of course, we were taught in seminary, Sion, and to draw them out. So with Sheol, it's really Sheol. Now, another term that we'll be dealing with is the word for grave, and that's kever. Q-E-B-E-R, soft B, kever. Grave, never confused in the Hebrew, but it is in the King James quite often. Then another term is bor, B-O-R, bor, which means pit. Sheol, grave, and pit are not the same. They're where we wouldn't have 3, would we? But they're often confused in translations with the English word hell, which means hall. It's an English term, and it didn't even occur in Greek. The Greek word is Gehenna, place of fire, but we'll get to that later. Well, there are the 3 terms we'll be referring to as we look at the Bible. Now, death, the Israelite believed that the body went to the grave, the kever, returned to dust, as we see in Genesis 3. But he did not believe that that ended the existence of the person or the personality, but that the nephesh, or the person. Remember from your previous studies, nephesh means the person. It's often translated me or I. And the nephesh went to Sheol. But what about bor or the pit? Well, we're coming to that. At death, the Israelite believed the body went to kever, the grave, returned to dust, according to Genesis 3. Dust thou art, to dust thou shalt return. The person, however, was not in the grave, but in Sheol. The nephesh. In at least one passage, and I doubt you could really argue for more than that, or much more than that, bor, B-O-R, which means pit. In one passage at least, it's parallel for Sheol. And so since it is, we'll just look at it. But it's a poetic use, Isaiah 38:18. Isaiah 38:18. We've already said the terms are not parallel. They're not the same. If they were, we wouldn't need 3 words. Now, pit has something to do with Sheol, but it's not Sheol. But here's a passage, Isaiah 38:18, where it seems to be parallel. For the grave cannot praise thee, death cannot celebrate thee, they that go down to the pit cannot hope for truth. I've got a King James. Anyone have anything later than that? Probably grave should have been Sheol. Is it Sheol? Okay. All right, so the word there, grave, is really Sheol. You see, King James, I don't think they ever said Sheol. Don't think they ever did just say what it is. So it's not the grave. The grave is where the body goes. So we'll translate it the way it is in the Hebrew. For Sheol cannot praise thee, death cannot celebrate thee, they that go down to the pit cannot hope for thy truth. And it seems like death, pit, and Sheol are parallel in that passage. They're not parallel, but there's no problem with that passage because He's not trying really to teach the meaning of terms or anything, but he's just saying the same thing in three different ways, talking about Sheol, pit, and death. He's really saying the same thing three times, kind of a poetic way that the Hebrews had. But other than a passage like that where it's obviously not to be equated, although it's an attempt to say the same thing three different ways, other than that, Sheol and pit are not parallel. Now, there are two classic passages in the Old Testament where we have some understanding with respect to what the Hebrew knew about the afterlife, that is, after the body went to the grave. What happened to the soul or the nephesh or the person? That is Isaiah 14. Really just one verse, I believe, verse 15. Isaiah 14:15. And then a long passage in Ezekiel 32. And you might put in parentheses the last few verses of chapter 31 of Ezekiel. I'll say a word or two about those passages and then we'll look at them. In these two passages, which teach the Hebrew concept of the place as well as the state of the dead. Not only the place of the person, but the state of the dead. We see a distinction in these passages between Sheol and the pit, that they're not the same, and it's purposely stated that they're not the same. That is, between Sheol and Bor. But in these passages, Bor, or the pit, is used to designate the lowest regions of Sheol. For the really bad guys, you know. They're not just in Sheol, but they're down in the bottom of it. Especially Ezekiel 31 and 32 suggest divisions and segregation in Sheol, which will be significant later when we get to Hades, because that's precisely the way it is in New Testament teaching, that there's a division in the place of departed spirits. And we'll see that not only is there a separation in Sheol between righteous and wicked, because they both go to Sheol. The Old Testament over and over says that. So it can't be hell, as King James translated. Not only is there a separation between the righteous and wicked in Sheol, as we'll see, but there seems to be and is a segregation between the wicked, those who have done grosser crimes and so forth, are cast into what is called the nether regions, the lowest parts of Sheol, the lowest parts of the pit. And of course, in the New Testament, you have the teaching by Jesus himself that they who have had much responsibility and have not met it will be beaten with many stripes, and those who did not know the will of God and lost anyway will be beaten with few stripes. And then another thing to watch out for as we read the passages, there's the reference to circumcised and uncircumcised in Ezekiel. Those terms have spiritual implications. Well, Isaiah 14, having said that, and we may repeat some of that as we go along, Isaiah 14:15. Now remember, the Old Testament saint didn't have a lot of light, not like we do in the New, but he had sufficient. Now here's a reference to the fact that Sheol and the pit are not the same. Speaking of Babylon, God says you'll be brought down to Sheol. It's hell in King James, but that's certainly a mistranslation. To Sheol, to the sides of the pit. Now, before we look at the Ezekiel passage, let me give you the meaning of Sheol. You don't need really the meaning of pit, that's self-explanatory. When God cast the rebellious Israelites down into the pit, opened the earth alive and cast them down into the pit, you know where they went. Sheol can be variously translated, but I think there's only one proper meaning, and the other meanings will even suggest the proper one. The abode of the dead, sometimes we translate that way, but then that could be the grave if you didn't explain it. the unseen world, but literally it's the place of departed spirits. And so when God said of Babylon, the inhabitants, of course, He's going to bring them down to Sheol, He said, I'll bring you down to the place of the dead, that is, the departed spirits, to the sides of the pit. In other words, He's making a distinction between those who go into Sheol, die a natural death, and those who are cast to other regions in the pit of Sheol. Now let's look at Ezekiel 32, beginning with verse 17, and God is dealing here with the fate of Egypt. And here is really the classic passage in the Old Testament showing divisions within Sheol itself. Now keep in mind, the Old Testament repeatedly says both the righteous and the wicked go to Sheol. See, so it's not hell, it's not the pit, it's the place of departed spirits where the righteous are lost. But in that place of departed spirits, there is a pit that the wicked are cast into, and the most wicked are cast into the nether regions of it, the bottom of it, special places in it. As we'll see, generally, the principle on which they're cast into the lowest part is whether or not they've oppressed Israel. And of course, we have the teaching in Old and New Testament, he that touches a Jew is touching the apple of God's eye. There are a lot of safer things to play around with than criticizing or hurting Jews. Came to pass, verse 17, Ezekiel 32, in the 12th year, that the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, wail for the multitude of Egypt. See, this is a prophecy against Egypt. Wail for them and cast them down, even her and the daughter of the famous nations, unto the nether parts of the earth, with them that go down to the pit. See, down into the bowels of the earth, with them that go down to the pit, not just in Sheol, but those wicked people in the pit. Whom dost thou pass in beauty? He speaks to Egypt. Go down and be thou laid with the uncircumcised. Now that's significant because while most people probably think only Jews were circumcised, no, the covenant of circumcision was given to Abraham, the father of the Hebrew nation. But there are other peoples who practice that, and Egypt was one of the nations. But they're to be cast down as if they were uncircumcised. Now you can already see that circumcision and uncircumcision, even in the Old Testament, had spiritual connotations. I assume you know that without me pressing the point. And speaking of Egypt, they shall fall in the midst of them that are slain with the sword. She is delivered by the sword. Draw her and all of her multitudes. In other words, she's not even going to lie with the wicked who died a natural death. Went to sleep, as they say, with a smile on their face. And only problem was they were lost, but died peacefully in their sleep. But Egypt's going down with those who've been slain with the sword. And the implication is in judgment. The strong among the mighty shall speak to him out of the midst of Sheol with them that help him. They are gone down, they lie uncircumcised, slain by the sword. Assyria is there, and all her company. His graves are about him, all of them slain, fallen by the sword, whose graves are set in the sides of the pit. You see, there are distinctions in the pit. And her company is round about her grave, all of them slain, fallen by the sword, which caused terror in the land of the living. There's Elam, and all her multitude round about her grave, all of them slain, fallen by the sword, which are gone down uncircumcised into the nether parts of the earth, which caused their terror in the land of the living, yet have they borne their shame with them that go down in the pit. Now you might, if you're really seriously considering studying some of these terms, you see nether parts of the earth, sides of the pit. These are all distinctions, segregations within Sheol. They have set her a bed in the midst of the slain with all her multitude. Here he's speaking of Elam, who caused terror in the land of the living, but now she's no terror. She's borne her shame with those who go down in the pit. And they've set her bed in the midst of the slain with all of her multitude, her graves round about him, all of them uncircumcised. In other words, they're in a place where those outside the covenant go to, the wicked. They're slain by the sword, speaking of judgment. Though their terror was caused in the land of the living, yet have they borne their shame with them that go down to the pit. He is put in the midst of them that be slain. There's Meshach and Tubal, speaking of nations, and all her multitude, her graves are round about him, all of them uncircumcised, slain by the sword, though they caused their terror in the land of the living. And they shall not lie with the mighty. He's naming those who will not lie with the mighty, that is, mighty from man's side, not God's. They'll not lie with the mighty that are fallen of the uncircumcised, which are gone down to Sheol with their weapons of war, and they've laid their swords under their heads, but their iniquities shall be upon their bones, though they were the terror of the mighty in the land of the living. In other words, Egypt and some of these others that God had pronounced special judgment against and who were slain by the sword, one nation slaying another by God's sovereign decree. From man's side, there was nothing more dignified or honorable than to be a warrior, and when you die or get killed, to have your sword and shield laid under your head, be buried that way. Well, God is saying here, Egypt, for example, won't even get to lie with those who in this world and who died and were considered mighty warriors because they died with their swords and shields under their head. Egypt won't even get to lie with those. They're going to have to lie with the uncircumcised. Yea, thou shalt be broken in the midst of the uncircumcised. Remember, the Egyptians were circumcised. You shall lie with them that are slain with the sword. And there's Edom, her kings. Edom, an ancient enemy of Israel, as you know, through Jacob and Esau. There's Edom, her kings, and all of her princes, which with their might are laid by them that were slain by the sword. They shall lie with the uncircumcised, and with them that go down to the pit. There will be the princes of the north, all of them, and all the Sidonians, which are gone down with the slain with their terror. They are ashamed of their might. They lie uncircumcised with them that are slain by the sword, and bear their shame with them that go down to the pit. Now they're all in Sheol, but he's talking about these that go into the pit. Then he's back to Egypt. Pharaoh shall see them, and shall be comforted over all the multitude. Well, it's not the best translation. The idea is he will have some satisfaction in finding out he's not the only one in the pit in Sheol. But it's more satire than anything else. Even Pharaoh and all of his army slain by the sword, saith the Lord. For I have caused my terror in the land of the living, and he shall be laid in the midst of the uncircumcised with them that are slain with the sword and all his multitude. So Egypt, though circumcised, being an enemy of Israel, is to lie with the uncircumcised. Well, a careful reading of that, and maybe some even better translations, like the ASV, which is what I used to teach out of in the seminary. Some of the phrases are a little clearer. You'll see there are distinctions in Sheol, as we will see and as we already know, that both the righteous and the wicked go to Sheol. But the wicked are not only separated from the righteous, they go to the pit, but there's segregations in the pit itself. And we have phrases like this to distinguish it. The lowest pit in Psalm 88:6. The lowest pit, Psalm 88:6. Whatever is down there in Sheol, in the nature of a pit, it has compartments, as it were. Now, we're speaking spiritually, but we're speaking literally too. The lowest pit, the lowest Sheol in Deuteronomy 32:22. God said he'll cast the wicked down into the lowest Sheol. So Sheol itself, you see, has a lower part, and of course we already know what it is, the pit. Deuteronomy 32:22. The chambers of death in Sheol. There are chambers of death in Sheol. Proverbs 7:27. The uttermost parts of the pit. Isaiah 14:15. Ezekiel 32:23. And so the principle of judgment and where you lie in the pit if you're lost in the Old Testament seems to be the nations that oppressed and persecuted Israel like Egypt and Edom, though circumcised, both the Edomites and the Egyptians, nevertheless they go down to lie with those in the lowest parts of the pit, those wicked Gentile nations like Assyria and Elam, who are uncircumcised. And to be uncircumcised in the Old Testament, of course, is to be lost. You know, it's just the spiritual conception, because circumcision and uncircumcision have spiritual implications. Now, since the Israelite who was circumcised also went to Sheol, then obviously he didn't go into the pit, because we see a distinction in Sheol just by implication. Now, a couple of other terms before we move on that occur in the Old Testament, and maybe most people think they're just in the New, is what is commonly pronounced Abaddon, but it's Avadon. A, B, A, D, D, double D, O, N. Usually mispronounced Abaddon, but it's Avadon. That is, if you're in the Old Testament. And it means destruction. And it seems to be equated in the Old Testament, in some sense at least, with the pit. In other words, there's destruction in the pit. Because in the New Testament, Abaddon, Avadon, Abaddon, in Revelation 9:11, the term is applied to the angel of the pit, where destruction is. So Avadon and the pit are the place of destruction. Same place. And in the Old Testament, it's the idea of a place for the destroyed dead, as opposed to a person who just dies a natural death. Avadon. It's a place where the ruined or destroyed dead are cast. And of course, in Revelation 9:11, we're told that he's getting the concept from the Hebrew. That's where it came from. In the Hebrew, it's Abaddon or Avadon. And since Avadon is the name of the angel of the pit, then in Old Testament usage it would be related to the pit. Then another term that occurs in the Old Testament is T-O-P-H-E-T. T-O-P-H-E-T, Tophet. I think it's written T-H in the King James. T-O-P-H-E-T-H, Tophet, modern pronunciation. And it means a fireplace, place of fire, from a root word which means to burn. And Tophet in the Old Testament, as well as the New, is in the valley of Hinnom, by the side of Jerusalem, where Molech, M-O-L-E-C-H, Molech worship was conducted. And the principal aspect of the worship of Molech was child sacrifice, called in the Old Testament, or King James, passing them through the fire, but of course it refers to offering the children by fire. Such passages as 2 Kings 23, Jeremiah 7, 31, 32, Jeremiah 19, 4 to 13, 23, 35. Tophet. In the valley of Hinnom. Now in Hebrew, of course, the word for valley is gay, and then the valley of Hinnom, a valley belonging to someone named Hinnom, H-I-N-N-O-M. That would be G-E-H-I-N-N-O-M. Gehinnom. And of course, in the New Testament, that's the word Jesus uses, Gehenna. Translated in the King James as hell, but he didn't have that word because that's Middle Age English at least. But he had Gehenna, which literally means the valley of Hinnom. But here's where Molech, the false god Molech, was worshipped, and he was worshipped by child sacrifice, offering them in a fire offering or burning them on an altar like you would an animal sacrifice. Now the Israelites, apostate Israelites, participated in that kind of worship. After the exile, because of that, it became an accursed place, an abominable place, and it became the dump, the city dump for Jerusalem. The valley's still there, I've seen it. As far as I know, it's still a dump. And of course, Jesus uses the expression in the New Testament that the wicked will be cast into a place, he said Gehenna, the valley of Hinnom, and pointed to the dump, of course, where the worm dies not and the fire is not quenched. Because a dump always has worms eating things, and, well, generally they're burning somewhere. You can smell them when you pass them. So after the exile, it became a city dump. Because of this, and because of the prophecy of Jeremiah in Jeremiah 7:31-33, that out in the future, Tophet would be the place where God would punish the wicked. Because of that, then Gehenna became a symbol of a place of future punishment of the wicked. Now, when we say symbol, we don't mean that it isn't real. But the term Jesus used was the valley of Hinnom. He said, it's better to enter into life maimed, if your hands or your eyes are causing you to stumble in sin, it's better to cut them off or pluck them out than to be cast into, King James says, hell. But he said, into Gehenna. And everyone knew what he meant. The city dump, he said, where the worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched. And of course that symbol is taken up in the book of Revelation and becomes the lake of fire. Hell is all right because we know what it means, but that isn't the word he used. He used this term here. And Tophet was the original designation of that place. In fact, it's used in another passage in Isaiah 30 and verse 33 as a place of punishment. In fact, I'll just read that. Tophet is a synonym for what we think of as hell in the New Testament, Isaiah 30:33. So the New Testament teaching on hell and Hades and whatever really has its basis in the Old Testament. Speaking of king of Babylon, for Tophet is ordained of old. We could say the lake of fire, or hell, is ordained of old. Yea, for the king it's prepared. He hath made it deep and large, that is God. And the pile thereof is fire, and much wood. And the breath of the Lord, like a stream of brimstone, doth kindle it. So there's another use of Tophet. You can look it up in a concordance. But Tophet was the place where they practiced child sacrifice by fire. And that was in the valley of Hinnom. And in Hebrew, valley of Hinnom is Gehinnom. And the Greek pronunciation of it is Gehenna. Well, if you have an interlinear Greek testament, you won't find hell as the translation, because, as I say, that's an old English word. And the term Jesus used repeatedly was Gehenna, the place of burning, place where the worm dies not and the fire is not quenched. All of which ought to bring us up to beliefs regarding the dead, that is, Old Testament beliefs. Their attitude or concept of their dead. We're talking about the future life, what they knew about it. We, in the New Testament era, know a lot more about it, I suppose, but we've got a lot more people that don't care to know anything about it, too, until it's too late. Beliefs regarding the dead, I want to mention two that are significant and characteristic of Hebrew belief, and that has to do, one with burial, the other with the place of burial, or the sepulcher, family grave. Now, as you study the Old Testament, you see that burial was indispensable to the Hebrew. Because of the nature of man, created in the image of God, and two, out of respect for the dead, and three, because the Hebrew, unlike the Greeks, didn't divide man up. It was body and nephesh that made man, you see, as well as spirit, of course. So the body was something that was not to be just cast out, often as the heathen did, or to be burned on a funeral pyre, which, of course, is the background, the heathen background of present-day cremation. But there was respect because there was a certain sacredness about the body, with the idea in mind you didn't want to treat it with disrespect. That's what we're saying. Now we understand, of course, and they did too, that, as we've already said, the body goes back to dust, but it still symbolized or represented the person. So burial always to an Israelite was indispensable, and he hardly ever withheld it to anyone, even his enemies or criminals. And this was by God's ordination. Even a criminal that was hanged was to be cut down and buried, not left to hang there. Deuteronomy 21, 21 and 23. A person who was stoned because of sin was to be buried. Joshua 7, 22 to 24. Or one's enemies was to be accorded burial. Ezekiel 39, 12. Now, loss of burial to an Israelite was more or less a calamity. And the significance of that lies in the fact that, you see, one of the curses pronounced upon Jezebel by God is that she would not be buried. 2 Kings 9:10. She'd be left, for the beasts to eat and so on. This is the fate, lack of burial, that awaited God's enemies. Isaiah 66:24, Jeremiah 25:33. Now we could look up all those passages, but sometimes I think it's evident that you get the significance without always looking them up. You see, the Hebrew idea, as we've given you many, many months ago concerning body, soul, and spirit, of the unity of the person, which is foreign to Greek culture and crept into the church, where today there's such a stress on getting the soul saved, whereas Jesus, as well as the Old Testament, look upon an individual as a person, and the whole person gets saved. That's why in Isaiah 53 we have redemption of the whole man. He speaks of physical healing as well as spiritual healing, contrary to the majority of the teaching today, as you know. But the concept that the Hebrew had is the one we have to have, because most of the New Testament is written by Hebrews. Luke might be an exception. And they didn't have the Greek idea of dividing up man. Now he consists of body, soul, and spirit because we're taught that in the New Testament as well as the Old. But we've covered that already. We don't have to labor it again, but his idea of the unity of man, that there was something abnormal and wrong when the body went to the grave and the nephesh went to Sheol. You see, that's abnormal. That isn't normal. And they have to get back together. So the Old Testament taught resurrection, as we'll see later, as well as the New. He's not complete without a body. Paul, he wanted to be absent from the body and present with the Lord, but he wanted to be clothed upon with that new body. So the body and the soul, being the total personality, helps us understand the idea of the Hebrew. Of course, as we said, God commands that burial be done in some cases. In other cases, when it's withheld, it's judgment. And to the Hebrew, since the body constituted a part of the person, remembering it's abnormal when they're separated, then an outrage to a corpse was considered a crime. Like cutting the head off. 1 Samuel 31, 8 to 10, the case of King Saul, where they cut his head off and hung his body on the walls of Bethshan. And so there was a certain attitude toward burial that the Hebrews had that all cultures didn't necessarily have. person's dead body, well, they'll put it on a funeral pyre, burn it, or other cultures yet today will put it on another sort of erected apparatus and let the birds, the buzzards eat and pick the bones clean. But it's a part of heathenism. You can probably think of other ways of disposing of bodies, like today, the heathen practice of cremation. We taught you on that in ethics. You can go back and listen to those tapes. It just isn't Christian. No such thing as Christian cremation. It's out of line with everything that is implied by God creating us in His image. Now, another concept we might look at that is significant among the Hebrews, the family grave. Not only burial, but the family grave was important to the Hebrew. Where I guess if a person really has faith in the Lord, and he's one who dies, of course we're not confessing all that here, with these being the last days, but if a person dies, I don't suppose it matters where he's buried. What would it matter to you where you were buried? That isn't you. But a Hebrew really didn't think that way. He wanted to be buried with the family. And so you'd have family sepulchres. Have you noticed the frequent mentions in the Old Testament of him being gathered to his fathers? Genesis 15:15, for example. Judges 2:10, or gathered to his people, Genesis 49:29-33, Numbers 27:13. Now don't carry that too far. The pious Israelite believed in an afterlife, and to be gathered to his fathers who were with the Lord, then it didn't imply just being in the sepulcher, the body. Gathered to his people could also imply, Isaac and Jacob being where Abraham is. Not just in the sepulcher, but where he is, the nephesh. And of course, the Hebrew, the Jewish nation yet today is quite, the concept of corporateness or solidarity prevails in the Hebrew culture. Because of that, he wanted to carry that over even into the afterlife. So he wanted to be buried in the family sepulcher. And to be deprived, the deprivation of such burial, could be an indication of divine judgment, like in 1 Kings 13:22. And the Hebrew didn't like that. Even in death, he wanted to be with his family. In 1 Kings 13:22, you have the prophet there, true prophet, but he disobeyed God about a matter, and so God said, all right, I'm going to send a lion to kill you. And in 1 Kings 13:22, God said, and you'll not be gathered to your fathers. A lion will slay you, and you'll not be gathered to your fathers. Which meant there, of course, he'd not be in the family sepulcher. Then you remember, which illustrates the importance of what we're saying, how both Jacob and Joseph, who went down into Egypt, insisted on what? He said, the Lord has told us, like he told Abraham, he told Jacob, he told Joseph, the Lord has told us that Israel's going out of Egypt one day, and when you go out, we command you, both Jacob and Joseph said it, take our bodies with you. Now when Joseph said it, of course, that's 400 years before they left. Said, carry our bodies back to Canaan and bury us in the family sepulcher. Genesis 47:30 and Genesis 50:25. And in Exodus 13:19 we find they did just that. Now we come to a distinction between Sheol, the grave, point D on your outline, the distinction in the Old Testament between Sheol and the grave. So we've already said the King James translates Sheol, never transliterates it that way, but translates it as the grave, Genesis 37:35, as hell, Deuteronomy 32:22, as the pit in Numbers 16:30-33. But the proper meaning is that the grave, of course, receives the body, and Sheol receives the nephesh. And it's the place of departed spirits, whether good or bad. Never confused in the Old Testament. For example, in Genesis 25:8 and 9, we're told that Abraham was gathered to his people, but we're told his body was buried in the sepulcher. So the grave and Sheol are not equated. Genesis 25:8 and 9 speaks of Abraham being gathered to his people. Abraham was. See, not his body, but his body in the sepulcher. The psalmist in Psalm 141 verse 7 tells us the grave, kever, is the door to Sheol. So since they could open a sepulcher any time they want and see the body still there, or the bones, depending on how long, then something went to Sheol besides the body. The psalmist says the grave is the door to Sheol. Again, Jacob said he would go down to Sheol mourning for his son. He said, I'll go down to my son, mourning. But we're told that Jacob thought Joseph had been devoured by wild beasts. So he wasn't going into the animal's stomach to be with his son. So in other words, wherever Joseph's body was is not where Jacob was going to meet his son. Again, we're told the rich man, we move over for a moment into the New Testament, the rich man died and was buried. Next phrase is, in Hades he lifted up his eyes, being in torments. We're told he's buried, and yet he was in Hades. So the distinction between Sheol and the grave is seen in the Old Testament from those considerations. Then the relation between Sheol and Hades, the relation. What is the relation? Well, of course, you know, I suppose already, that Sheol is the Old Testament term. Hades is a new one. Hades, literally, Hades, H-A-D, long E-S, Hades. The relationship between Sheol and Hades is that Sheol is always equated in the New Testament with Hades, Sheol and Hades. In other words, Hades translates Sheol in the New Testament. If they quote a passage using Sheol in the Old Testament, they won't say Sheol in the New, they'll translate it with Hades. Because Hades, of course, would have the Greek understanding of it. Greeks wouldn't know. Gentiles wouldn't know what Sheol was, but they'd know what Hades was during the New Testament period. To give you one example, Psalm 16:10 with Acts 2:27. Psalm 16:10 with Acts 2:27, which we can quote, of course, you can too. The prophecy about Jesus, thou shalt not leave my nephesh in Sheol, my soul in Sheol. That's what the Hebrew says, thou shalt not leave my nephesh in Sheol. Then in Acts 2:27, it's translated by Peter, thou shalt not leave my soul in Hades. Or, of course, he spoke Greek and he would have suke and Hades. But anyway, it always translates it, and that's a good example. So there must be equivalent terms. You can't have New Testament inspired writers using terms that don't properly translate the Old Testament Hebrew. That wouldn't make any sense. Another thing, the Septuagint, the LXX Septuagint, which everybody knows what it is by now, where the Hebrew scholars translated Hebrew into Greek, the Old Testament into Greek, they always translate Sheol with Hades. And they certainly should know how to translate it. We're not saying the Septuagint was inspired. It had its place and all, but the New Testament certainly is. In closing tonight's study on future life in the Old Testament, there are primarily two interpretations. Two interpretations with regard to the relationship between Sheol and Hades. And the first is the fundamentalist interpretation from the Schofield Bible. And the other is another interpretation. I'm not passing any kind of judgment upon fundamental or Schofield, because I figure that I'm fundamental. And somewhere I've got a Schofield Bible. Well, fundamentalists believe a lot of things that are right out of the Schofield Bible. Sometimes when you start substituting the footnotes for the text, you get in trouble. People quote you the footnotes or the commentaries. So there are two views, the Schofield view, and fundamentalists almost to a man, I guess, follow that. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just going to give it to you. And then we'll say, maybe. The other view, I believe, is more nearly correct, because the Schofield view, while you couldn't prove it wrong, yet they can't prove they're right. And yet most of them insist that this is the only way it can be. Now I'm going to read you the Schofield footnote, maybe without comments. We'll see how it goes. Under the Greek term Hades, and I think this is the footnote on Ephesians chapter 4, he says, the unseen world is revealed as the place of departed human spirits. He's speaking about Hades. Now he's certainly right there. At least we believe he's right. It's what we've already taught you. The unseen world, Hades, is revealed as the place of departed human spirits between death and the resurrection. The word occurs, and then he gives many passages. And it's the equivalent, Hades is the equivalent of the Old Testament Sheol. And he cites Habakkuk 2:5, where it's translated in the New Testament. I suppose he's referring there to Romans. The Septuagint invariably renders Sheol with Hades, another thing we've already stated. Now he summarizes his teaching on Hades under two heads: Hades before the ascension of Christ and Hades since the ascension of Christ. He says, Hades before the ascension of Christ. These passages in which the word Hades occurs makes it clear that Hades was formerly in two divisions: the abode of the saved and the lost. The former place was called Paradise, or Abraham's bosom. Both designations were Talmudic and adopted by Christ in Luke 16:22 and 23:43. It means adopted by Christ. Christ simply used terminology people understood. That's all he means by that. The blessed dead were with Abraham. They were conscious and comforted. Luke 16:25. The believing malefactor was to be that day with Christ in paradise. The lost were separated from the saved by a great gulf fixed. Luke 16:26. He's talking about in Hades, the righteous and the wicked are separated, but they both go to Hades before the ascension. The representative man of the lost who are now in Hades is the rich man of Luke 16. He was alive, conscious, in full exercise of his faculties. He had memory and so forth. He was in torment. There's a real sermon on Luke 16. I used to preach it quite a bit about all of those things. You know, rich man died, and death didn't end it all. He discovered that one moment after death, and the message emphasized, where will you be one moment after death? But you're saved here. I don't preach that one to you. But I used to travel around. Baptists won't like this, but I got to say it anyway. I used to travel around to a lot of Baptist churches. Back during my college days, I preached in, I guess, over 50. And that was my candy stick sermon for Baptists. Candy stick sermon simply means, in a homiletical class, the one you like best, or the one that gets the most results. And I actually got to the place where I quoted the whole passage of Luke 16 by heart. I'd read it so much, I just quit, trying to read it. I just quoted. I probably can still just about do it. Now, Hades since the ascension of Christ. So far as the unsaved dead are concerned, no change of their place or condition is revealed in the Scriptures. At the judgment of the great white throne, Hades will give them up. They will be judged and pass into the lake of fire, Revelation 20. But a change has taken place which affects paradise and the saved. Paul was caught up to the third heaven into paradise. 2 Corinthians 12. Paradise, therefore, is now in the immediate presence of God. It is believed that Ephesians 4, 8-10 indicates the time of this change. In other words, no change with the wicked. They're still in Hades, but a change, he says, did take place when Christ ascended. And he quotes Ephesians 4. When he ascended on high, he led a multitude of captives, or King James led captivity captive. It is immediately added that he had previously descended first into the lower parts of the earth, that is, the paradise division of Hades. Now that's his insertion. That isn't what the text says. During the present church age, the saved who died are absent from the body at home with the Lord. The wicked dead in Hades and the righteous dead at home with the Lord alike await resurrection. Schofield view. In other words, he says a change took place at the ascension. That is the popular fundamentalist view. Sheol, which is the New Testament Hades, both the righteous and the wicked go to Sheol. It's a place of departed spirits. It's simply the realm of the dead. That's all it means. It doesn't mean a place where you're locked up. If you're righteous, it means the place of the departed dead. And he says, and properly so, that in Sheol there was a division between the wicked and the righteous. We know the wicked from Ezekiel and Isaiah were in the pit, or are in the pit. The righteous, we're not told too much about that, but there's a little bit, and we'll get to that later, where they were. Then he says, at the ascension of Christ, we come to the New Testament, and Sheol is now Hades, same thing, different term between Greek and Hebrew. When Christ led captivity captive, I wonder if he searched for the proof text or had the doctrine, and then found a proof text or read the text and got the teaching. I don't know. But he said, that means when he led captivity captive that the righteous, and that's where I have a little problem with it, that they were captive. Except maybe if he means they were captive in death, but they're still dead in that sense. They're not resurrected yet. So he led captivity captive. He said at that moment is when Hades no longer held the righteous, but now when they die, they're immediately present with the Lord. I think we'll find some Old Testament passages that suggest that they were present with the Lord already before the ascension. But we'll have to wait till at least next time to get to those passages. The other view agrees with the Schofield view that both the righteous and the wicked were in Sheol, but separated, the wicked being punished and the righteous at rest, which we'll see about later. At that point it agrees. But in the New Testament, Christ reveals that the righteous in reality had always gone to paradise. It didn't wait for Ephesians 4. Had always gone to paradise. Luke 16 says, they're in Abraham's bosom, and that was before the ascension. And Abraham's bosom would certainly be a place of peace and rest and repose, or paradise. So Christ reveals in his teaching the reality that the righteous had always gone to paradise, or God's presence. Hence, the Israelite of the Old Testament had gone as far as the light of revelation could take him. And when Christ came, he didn't reveal that a change had or was going to take place, but that the location of paradise, the abode of the righteous, had never changed. Only one's understanding of the doctrine. In other words, the Old Testament saint didn't have the light that Christ came giving. Nothing has changed with respect to the righteous or wicked. It's just our understanding of it is what this view holds. That when Christ came and made a clear distinction between Hades and paradise, he was merely revealing the full meaning of the truth contained in the Old Testament. The actual abode of the wicked has never changed. The abode of the righteous, who were also in Sheol, is now revealed in the New Testament to be paradise. The thief, today you'll be with me in paradise. He didn't say in the compartment of Sheol or Hades, which we call paradise. The point that this view is trying to make is that the abode of the righteous and wicked did not change under Christ's teaching, but he gave the revelation of what took place in the place of departed spirits. The wicked went to what can be called torment in Hades, and the righteous went to be with the Lord. You see, even said of Christ, "Thou shalt not leave my soul or nephesh or me in Hades." So this view contends that no New Testament saint is ever said to go to Hades. No New Testament saint. Christ's experience accepted. But even that's a prophecy, speaking about you'll not leave me in the place of departed spirits. It's not the JDS era. In fact, they don't even use Hades. They say hell. He went to hell 3 days, and of course Christ said to the thief, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." In the Spirit, of course. So no New Testament saint in this view is ever said to go to Hades, Christ's experience accepted. Secondly, this view contends, as we pointed out, Hades always translates Sheol, and paradise never does. And in the Old Testament, Sheol is an inclusive term for the place of the departed dead. The actual distinction outside those suggestions in Ezekiel and Isaiah, the actual distinction was made clear with the full revelation that Christ gave when he came. There was never any change took place at the Ephesians 4 time level, as Schofield teaches. The righteous always went to paradise. The wicked always went to the pit. But see, the full revelation wasn't given in the Old Testament. While separation is certainly suggested and taught in Ezekiel 32 and some other passages, like God will cast them down to the lowest parts of the pit, it shows segregation and so forth. There was really no change that took place, but Christ revealed what took place when a rich man or a lost man and the beggar or the saved man died. One went to paradise, Abraham's bosom, equivalent term, any interpreter knows that. You'd never get any other view by anybody. He's showing the righteous go to paradise, the wicked go to Hades. That is the torment part of Hades. But Hades itself merely means the place of departed spirits. But he's showing a distinction in Hades as paradise and the place of torment. And the only difference really between that and the Schofield view is that Schofield says that up until the time of Christ's ascension, when he led captivity captive, that the righteous and the wicked were held, as it were, in the prison of Sheol, although the righteous were not being punished. That would be the only difference between them and the wicked in Sheol. Well, I must say, by reading Ephesians 4, I wouldn't exactly get that out of it. I would really have to hear the view before I could come up with the Schofield view about that's when the change took place. I think when we get through all the studies, and you'll see the Hebrews had some concept of being with the Lord, even in the Old Testament when they died. There are several passages that deal with resurrection and the future hope. You put it all together and then hold with the view, you can't prove either one, but hold with the view that Christ is coming, revealing really what took place or what takes place in the afterlife. The righteous go to be with the Lord, Abraham's bosom, paradise. The wicked are in the pit, the nether regions of the pit. They're being punished. They're in the punishment part of Hades. And when Christ said that God would not leave his nephesh or his soul in Hades, he also said to the thief, this very day you'll be with me in paradise. So he didn't stay dead, the thief did. But both he and the thief that very day were in paradise. The paradise part of Hades, because he himself said, you won't leave me in Hades. So that must mean he went there. But that isn't hell. Hades translates Sheol, which is the place of departed spirits. It's just like if it was unveiled for you to see the realm of the dead, you'd see the spirits, in the realm of the dead. The wicked are, as we see in Luke 16 and Ezekiel 32, suffering punishment. The righteous are with the Lord. Always have been. Second view says they always have been. When Abraham died, he wasn't locked up somewhere in Sheol waiting for the resurrection. He went to be with the Lord. I know Moses and Elijah did. And that's still Sheol side of the cross, you see. They're Jews. Moses didn't have Greek, so he went to Sheol. Elijah didn't have Hades, Greek yet, so he went to Sheol. And then here they're appearing alive and busy about God's work in Matthew 17. So they're not locked up somewhere in limbo waiting for the resurrection. They're with the Lord. And so the second view, that's really the only difference. Schofield says the change took place at Christ's ascension. He led the captives out of Sheol or Hades, the righteous. The other view says there was never any change made when he ascended or at any other time, but Christ reveals fully what the Old Testament saint didn't have fully, what happened to the righteous and wicked after death. Wicked tormented, the righteous in Abraham's bosom are at rest, repose.